Welcome, bienvenidos, benvindo to the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, a production of Soccermetrics and Soccer Down Here, the only English language podcast devoted to South America's premier club competition. I'm your host, Howard Hamilton, the founder of Soccermetrics. We're at another off week in the Copa Libertadores. The majority of places in the Libertadores knockout stage have been confirmed. But with few exceptions, we don't know which teams will finish first or second in their groups. Next week, everything will be decided. Who will proceed in the Libertadores, who will be shunted off to the Sudamericana, and who will go no further in continental competition. In the meantime, I'll tell the story of one of the legendary sides of this competition and of South American football. There are news to report about the Libertadores, and we'll start the show with this news roundup. And we'll start with news item number 1. Brazil pauses national championship. Last week, Brazil's Football Association announced that they would pause match days 7 and 8 of the Brazilian top division. This in response to the continuing flooding disaster in the southern Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul. The Federation had already postponed matches involving teams from that state, who had their stadiums and training grounds flooded and could not travel. But the rest of the league lobbied the Federation to extend the postponement to the entire division. Now, all of the Brazilian teams in the Libertadores have either qualified for the knockout stage or in a strong position to qualify, with the exception of Grêmio, who are currently bottom of Group C, but with 2 games in hand. Grêmio happened to be located in Rio Grande do Sul, in Porto Alegre. They haven't played a match of any kind since April 30th, and their first match back will be the May 29 encounter against the Strongest. The club announced that their remaining home matches in the group stage will be played in Curitiba, about 750 kilometers from Porto Alegre in the state of Paraná. O Tricolor will have a punishing schedule. Over a period of 19 days, they will play 6 matches in the Brasileirão and the Libertadores. News item number 2. Peñarol bans Rosario Central fans. Ever since the incidents involving Rosario Central fans toward Peñarol before, during, and after their match in match day 1, the Uruguayan club stated they would not allow Central supporters at the reverse fixture in match day 6. On June 21st, Peñarol announced that no tickets will be made available to visiting fans for the Group G encounter next week. Speaking to a local sports radio station in Montevideo, Ignacio Alonso, president of Peñarol, said, quote, "Peñarol wants to minimize the risks and avoid consequences to people, the club, and also the stadium," end quote. He also said that the club's posture has the support of Uruguay's Football Association, but he has yet to discuss the matter with the CONMEBOL president. By rule, clubs competing in CONMEBOL competition must make at least 2,000 tickets available to visiting fans or pay a $20,000 fine. This is why, for example, despite visiting fans being barred from domestic league matches in Argentina, visiting fans are present in Libertadores or Sudamericana matches. Now, nothing has been confirmed yet, but I expect that Peñarol will have to swallow a fine rather than risking a repeat of the events of April 4. And it's not just a risk of Central fans causing damages, it's also the risk of Peñarol Barras imposing retribution for what happened last month. Now on to news item number 3. Javier Sanguinetti leaves Huachipato. On Monday, May 20th, Huachipato announced that Javier Sanguinetti has left the Chilean champions by mutual agreement. The 53-year-old Argentine had been in charge of the Steelers since last December for a total of 16 matches. Huachipato have struggled in this season's Chilean Primera and lie currently in 13th place, just 4 points above the relegation places. They have done better in the Libertadores, achieving an away win against Gremio, but their 4-1 defeat at the strongest has placed them in a delicate situation. Francisco Troncoso will take over as interim manager while Huachipato seek a replacement. They still have 2 matches to play at Estudiantes de La Plata and the rescheduled match at home to Gremio. And finally, news item number 4, Gabigol loses his shirt. There was a furor among Flamengo supporters on social media after striker Gabriel Barbosa was photographed at a barbecue wearing a Corinthians shirt. Corinthians, in case you don't know, are a bitter rival to Flamengo, the most bitter rival being Fluminense. And in response, the club fined Gabigol for being stupid and took away his right to wear the number 10 shirt. He will not be allowed to wear number 10 in Brazilian League or Cup matches, but he can wear number 10 in Libertadores matches. Corinthians actually expressed interest in signing Barbosa last December, but Flamengo refused to let him go. Then Barbosa and the front office reached an impasse on negotiations for a new contract, and then he was banned for interfering in a drug test, but that ban was stayed pending an appeal. Barbosa will be out of contract at the end of the year. That's the end of part 1. In part 2 of the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, I'll go into tonight's history lesson. 3, 2, 1, go. Part 2 of the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, a production of Soccermetrics and Soccer Down Here. There's a rich history surrounding the Copa Libertadores, whether you talk about legendary teams, players, managers, or moments. Some of that history isn't necessarily known outside of South America, so this episode is the second of a series of historical vignettes about the competition that I hope will present a fuller picture of South America's premier club competition. I'm talking today about the first South American super team in the Copa Libertadores era, Santos Futebol Clube. Now, it's really challenging to understand Santos FC without knowing about Santos the city. Santos the city is along the coast of Sao Paulo state in Brazil. It's about 50 kilometers, roughly 35 miles from Sao Paulo, the metropolis of Brazil. It has a population today of about 430,000. It's a port city. The port of Santos is the busiest container port in Latin America. And historically, it was the principal port of export for coffee. And Brazil was, and still is, the world's largest producer of coffee. So, to give you an idea of just how small Santos is relative to other major cities in Brazil, it's not even among the top 50 cities ranked by population in the country. Almost all the clubs in Brazil's top flight are in capital cities of the individual states. So most of the major teams in Brazil are massive. They are drawn from cities that are 3 to 25 times the size of Brazil. In fact, only Clube Guarani, which is a countryside team in the state of Sao Paulo, have won a national title. So in the early 1900s, Santos was the principal exporter of coffee. So a lot of money was flowing to the city. The sporting interests at the time were more in aquatic sports, especially the sport of rowing. This wasn't too unusual among South American sports clubs, especially those that catered to the elite. and most of these clubs did cater to the elite. There were two football clubs that were founded at the turn of the 20th century. One disappeared fairly quickly by 1910, and the other moved to the metropolis of Sao Paulo. So it was at that time, in the early 1910s, that Santos FC were founded. They were founded on April 14 by three sportsmen. Coincidentally, Santos FC were founded on the same day that the ship Titanic sank in the North Atlantic. So the saying goes that one giant sank into the waters and another giant rose. They competed successfully in city and state championships. The city championships successfully, state championships a little less so. In fact, they actually had to withdraw because of the demands of travel at that time. In 1916, they opened their own stadium in the neighborhood of Villa Belmiro. And it's a stadium at a site where that they currently occupy to this day. In the 1920s and 1930s, their supporters were known as peixe, or fish, by their rivals. And that was in reference to the port city origins of Santos. And a famous cartoon during that time represented Santos as a fish. So that moniker stuck to the team from that point. Also in the 1920s, Santos became known for the discovery and development of young talent. And that was something that remained something that the club was known for throughout their history. In 1935, they achieved their first success in a major competition. They won the Sao Paulo Championship, or the Paulista. In 1948, they won second place in the Sao Paulo Championship. So, if you were to think of Santos FC in the context of North American sports, and I would expect that a lot of listeners to this podcast are knowledgeable about sports in North America, there are some parallels to the Green Bay Packers of the NFL. Now, the parallels aren't extremely strong. There are some differences, of course, between North American sports and sports elsewhere. But what Green Bay and Santos have in common is that they represent relatively small metropolitan areas. They have smaller fan bases than other rival teams in their league, yet they have been among the top achieving teams in their competition. Santos FC have a small fan base, yet they are among the top three Brazilian teams in the number of state titles, the number of national titles, the number of Copa Libertadores, and the number of intercontinental cups. So how did this golden era of Santos start? So when we talk about Os Fantásticos, which was the moniker of Santos FC during this era, we have to talk about the manager of that team during that era, during the principal years of that era. Luis Alonso Perez, who is also called Lula, was born on March 1st, 1922. Of Spanish origin, he was born and raised in Santos. And his path to football was very different than that of a lot of other managers. He initially worked as a taxi driver, a baker, and a milkman. He did have a brief stint as a player, and he was known as an on-field general with traits of a manager before a knee injury forced him to quit playing. He started out his management career by leading amateur teams at a local level in the Santos area. And in 1949, Santos asked him to take over management of their amateur teams. In June of 1952, he managed the first team for the first time on an interim basis, and 2 years later, he took over the professional side on a permanent basis. He managed Santos until the end of 1966. Lula was known for his philosophy of the Meninos da Vila, the boys of Vila of Melnino. This involved the discovery and promotion of young talent mixed with experienced professionals. So Lula became known for discovering young players and, most importantly, giving young players the chance to contribute to the first team and make strong contributions. So Pepe, who is one of Santos's legendary players, would speak about the influence of Lula in 2013. He said, "When we speak of Santos, we really have to speak of the trainer. He made part of that squad. He was the person who promoted me as a juvenile player. I am so grateful to Lula. He was the first he was the first commander of our conquest, and he had a clinical eye to see the value of players." Pepe would go on to say that Lula wasn't a guy of tactics, this numerology that exists today, but rather he chose the 11 best players in accordance with each match. I think he was the most victorious manager in world football. He knew how to mix the team and he knew how to motivate players, and he was a friend of the group. End quote. So during this golden era of Santos football, these principal players form part of that squad. You start out with Zito. Zito was captain of the squad during the bulk of his tenure with the team, during the bulk of the Santasticos era. He made 733 appearances and scored 57 goals between 1952 and 1967. And he won the World Cup on 2 occasions. He was known as, quote, the manager, essentially the on-field representative of the manager, the on-field extension of Lula on the field. And he was more like a holding midfielder, a skilled ball winner, and he was known for setting the tempo of the team through his off-the-ball movement and his precise passing. Such was the influence of Zito in the history of Santos that Santos's armband isn't represented by a C for captain. It's represented by the letter Z or Z. Another principal player was Pepe. Pepe played his entire career with Santos, 750 appearances, scoring 405 goals between 1954 and 1969. He was a stalwart of the left wing on the field, and he was known for his exceptionally strong left foot. In fact, he was known as the Vila Cannon, scoring goals from free kicks and penalties. A two-time World Cup champion, he had the distinction of never being sent off in his professional career. Coutinho started with the first team at Santos at the age of 14. Starting in 1958 and through 1968, he made 455 appearances for the team, scoring 387 goals. He was the master of the small area in the penalty box, a devastating finisher, a skilled dribbler, known for combination play with teammates. Most significantly, he never lost to fellow Sao Paulo rival Corinthians in his career while at Santos. Mangalvio was a master of the midfield. He was part of what would become this legendary attacking quintet for Santos. He made 369 appearances between 1960 and 1969 and scored 27 goals. Dorval was a midfielder on the right wing. He was known as the fastest player of this attacking quintet. known for his tactical intelligence and strength. He played at Santos over four distinct spells between 1956 and 1967, making a total of 612 appearances and scoring 216 goals. The goalkeeper during this era, the principal goalkeeper during this era, was Gilmar, who started his career at Corinthians and later transferred to Santos in 1969, making a total of 266 appearances. He was selected three times for Brazil's World Cup teams between 1958 and 1966, and he was a starting goalkeeper in 1958 and 1962, the only starting goalkeeper to appear in consecutive World Cup winning teams. The International Federation of Football History and Statistics named Gilmar as the best Brazilian goalkeeper in the 20th century. You may not think that that is such a great distinction, given the historical stereotype of Brazilian goalkeeping, but Gilmar was known as being a great shot stopper, and most importantly, he was known for being a calm and sober person on the field. And that calmness and that sobriety inspired confidence in his defenders. In the back, you had players such as Mauro Ramos, who started at Sao Paulo during his career, making 489 appearances over a period of 11 years, and then transferred to Santos in the second half of his career, making a total of 351 appearances and scoring 66 goals. He was known as a player who was strong in the air and strong in tackle. In fact, an Italian journalist named Gianni Brera in 1992 named Mauro Ramos as the best sweeper to ever play world football. Ramos appeared in 3 World Cups in 1954. He was part of the winning squad in 1958, and he served as captain of the winning squad in 1962. Serving in front of him as defensive midfielder was Lima. He made 696 appearances between 1961 and 1971. Lima was unique in that he was strong on both sides of the field as a fullback, and he would be deployed on both sides given the state of the match and given the nature of the opponent. He also went on to score 65 goals, a very high number for a defender. Joel Camargo played for the team between 1963 and 1971, a total of 304 appearances as a defender. He started with the team at 16 years old and is still one of the youngest players to play for Santos FC. He was called the Azucarero, the sugar ball, because he had a tendency to run with his arms out to the sides. It's really hard to visualize that as a sugar ball, but it's really interesting that he was called that. And then another principal striker of that era, during almost the second half of this Santasticos era, was Toninho. Toninho made a total of 373 appearances between 1963 and 1969 and scored 313 goals. In fact, his 38 goals in the 1966 Paulista Championship was the one time that he overtook Pele, that any player overtook Pele as the leading goal scorer of Santos during that era. Unfortunately, he didn't appear in Brazil's World Cup winning squad in 1970 because of injury. Now, after Lula left, there are other players who gained a certain level of success and notoriety with Santos. These players included Orlando, who was a defender between 1965 and 69, Edu, who was a striker between 1966 and 1976, scoring close to 200 goals for the squad. Clodoaldo, who was a defensive midfielder stalwart between 1966 and 1979, a total of 510 appearances. And most famously, Carlos Alberto. Carlos Alberto appeared for Santos between 1966 and 1974 as a right back and a wing back, making a total of 445 appearances and scoring 40 goals for the club. He was the captain of the 1970 World Cup squad. And he's probably most famous for scoring what was, in my opinion, the best goal in World Cup history. The fourth goal in that legendary final against Italy. But, we cannot talk about principal players of the Santos era without talking about one Edson Arantes do Nascimento, otherwise known as Pele. Pele was born on October 23rd, 1940. He was named the Athlete of the Century by three institutions, the IFFHS, by FIFA, and by IOC. And as he probably guessed, as he probably surmised, he was named in honor of Thomas Edison, but his parents removed the I from the name. Now, Pele was actually his nickname because it came out of a mispronunciation of the name of one of his favorite players growing up. Pele moved to Sao Paulo at the age of 3, and he stood out playing youth soccer at Bauru Atletico Club. And he also played futsal in his early teens. Perhaps that is not really, perhaps we know that is where his skill of operating with the football in tight spaces developed. It was his youth soccer coach at the time, Valdemar de Brito, who talked his mother to let him go to Santos FC. And in 1956, it was Brito who introduced a young Pele to Santos officials and told him, this guy can become the best football player in the world. In June of that year, Lula gave Pele his first professional contract at the age of 15. In 1957, in the Rio Sao Paulo tournament, Pele burst onto the scene even as a substitute. In a series of matches in which he played on a combined Santos and Vasco da Gama team, he scored a total of 5 goals in 3 matches. And within 10 months of him receiving his initial professional contract, he was called up to the national team. And literally the rest is history. So over a total of 18 years, from 1956 to 1974, he scored a total of 1,091 goals in over 1,100 appearances. Now, the number of goals is disputed to this day because it includes not only goals scored in official competitions, but also goals scored in friendlies. What is beyond dispute is that he was the leading goal scorer in Sao Paulo championships, in the Paulista championships. He did this on 11 occasions, including 9 years in a row. And that streak and that total number of years in which he was leading goal scorer remain records in Brazilian football to this day. And he is the only player in the history of football to be a 3-time World Cup champion. So really to understand the dominance of Santos during that time, you really have to understand how Brazilian football was structured during that era. As I've said before, previously in this podcast, um, there was no national competition in Brazil, not in the sense that we understand a national tournament to this day, like a Premier League type competition, the type of league competition that we would expect in European leagues, in North American leagues, did not exist. Um, the principal competition in a lot of parts of Brazil at this time was the state championship. And during this era, either the Sao Paulo or the Rio de Janeiro championship were the most important. Another important tournament was the Rio Sao Paulo tournament. And this served as a precursor to the Brazilian championship, in which the top teams of Rio de Janeiro state and the top teams of Sao Paulo state faced off against each other. And then when the Copa Libertadores started, the Brazilian Football Federation formed what was known as the Taça Brasil. The literal meaning is Brazil Cup, but it's not the same thing as the Copa do Brasil that we know today. This was a competition in which um, all of the winners of the state tournaments would play each other. The Rio and Sao Paulo champions would have a bye to, I think, the semifinal round. And the winner of this tournament gained entry into the Copa Libertadores as a champion. So the start of this Fantásticos era is designated as 1955 when Lula arrived at the club. He won the Paulista title for the team, and this was the first title in 20 years. And the following year, they won again, 1956. A goal scorer named Emanuele Del Vecchio was the leading goal scorer with 23 goals. Pele was present in this team, but he had more of a subservient role to the contributions of Del Vecchio. And remember, Pele was only 15 years old, 15, 16 years old at this time. But the following year, everything changed for Pele and for Santos. Del Vecchio was sold to Verona of Italy. And this happened after a dispute with some really high figures in the Santos FC establishment. Pele was promoted to a starting striker role, and he was given a new shirt, number 10. Needless to say, Pele would hold on to that role for the rest of his career, and number 10 would become synonymous with the great man. In the Paulista tournament, Santos were only runners-up to Palmeiras. And in fact, during this golden era, during this 15-year period between 1955 and 1969, only Palmeiras and Santos would win the state title. Pele would go on to be the leading scorer with 17 goals in the competition, and he scored 57 goals across all competitions. In 1958, Santos finished only 7th in the Rio Sao Paulo tournament, Pele being the leading goal scorer. But they won another Paulista title, with Pele being the leading goal scorer with 58 goals, a mark which is still a record in state football in Sao Paulo. Santos would go on to place 3 players to the Brazilian World Cup squad: Pelé, Zito, and Pepe. And for the first time, we would hear that foreign clubs would express interest in the services of Pelé. Inter Milan, in fact, tried to sign him, and the word was that both teams were close to an agreement before a revolt of the players prevented the transfer. In 1959, we would see the first of many tours that Santos FC would make, uh, really marking off their success. And you have to remember during this time that that South American clubs were really a novelty in world football because of the relative lack of communication between different parts of the world. So there's still this legend, this mystique surrounding Santos FC. So they started on a tour of the Americas, um, playing friendlies in 7 countries. Um, and we would also see that Pele would play in almost all of them. And he would score at a rate of more than 1 goal per match. They would go on, they would return to Brazil, play in the Rio Sao Paulo tournament, which they won, and they embarked on another tour of Europe. In this tour, they played in 9 countries, a total of 22 matches in 44 days. Not only did Pele score in all of them, he would go on to score 28 goals. And in addition to Inter Milan, Real Madrid tried to sign Pele. Both clubs obviously were successful. Santos would return to Brazil and play in the Paulista tournament. The team would go on to score 151 goals in this competition, a mark which is still a record in the Paulista tournament. Pele would once again be the leading goal scorer with 44 goals, but the team ended up being tied at the top of the table with Palmeiras. And remember, this is an era where only 2 points were awarded per win. So because the teams were tied on number of points, they met in a tie-breaking playoff. In this playoff, the first 2 matches were tied. First match ended a 1-1 draw. The second match ended in a 2-2 draw. And the third match, Palmeiras ended victorious 2-1. In 1960, Santos FC embarked on yet another tour, playing 18 matches in 7 countries. Once again, Pele would play in all of them, and he would be the leading goal scorer. Returning to Brazil, they would win the Paulista tournament. The team scored 100 goals, and Pele scored a total of 32 goals, once again being the leading goal scorer. In fact, Pele scored 61 goals in the calendar year of 1960. 1961 would start to show Pele at the peak of his powers, as well as Santos starting to crest um, in their Santasticos era. They embarked on lucrative tours through the Americas and Europe, and in the official competitions, they would win the Paulista title, Pele being the leading goal scorer, and they would win their first Brazilian championship, the Taça Brasil, in which Pele became the leading goal scorer with 7 goals. Now, by winning the Taça Brasil, Santos, for the first time, would gain entry into the Copa Libertadores. And that leads us to the legendary year of 1962. It was a year in which Santos would win the Paulista title, um, another Paulista title. It would be their third in a row. They would go on to win another Brazilian title, another Taça Brasil, and they would place 7 players on the Brazilian World Cup squad: Gilmar, Mauro Ramos, Zito, Coutinho, Pelé, Pepe, and Mengalvio. In the Copa Libertadores in that era, in 1962, only the domestic league champions competed in the competition. And Venezuela didn't send a team. So there was a total of 9 teams, plus the holders Peñarol. Peñarol were actually 2-time defending champions of the Libertadores, and they received a berth to the semifinal. So there were three groups of three teams. Teams would play each other home and away, so a total of four matches. And the group winners would advance to the semifinal. Santos were drawn with Cerro Porteño of Paraguay and Deportivo Municipal of Bolivia. They would go on to win three of those matches. They drew away to Cerro Porteño, and they ended up scoring a total of 20 goals while allowing six. The best offensive and defensive records of all the teams in the group stage. Most significantly, during this group stage, Santos would play Cerro at home and defeat them by a score of 9-1. And this turned out to be the last match that Pelé would play in this tournament until the final. The World Cup happened during this time. Pelé got injured during the World Cup match. I believe it was during his second match of the World Cup. And he wasn't able to play until the very end of the year. Resuming after the World Cup finals, Santos would play Chile's Universidad Católica. They drew 1-1 in Santiago, and they won the return match 1-0 in Villa Belmiro. The final would see Santos face off against the two-time defending champion, Peñarol. In the first match, Santos actually defeated Peñarol in Montevideo 2-1. Alberto Spencer, the legendary striker for Peñarol, scored the first goal before Coutinho equalized and scored the winner at the 70th minute. In the second match, played in Villa Belmiro, Peñarol actually won 3-2. And this was under controversial circumstances. Spencer once again appeared and took the lead for Peñarol before Dorval equalized and Mengalvio gave the Black and Whites a 2-1 lead in the 35th minute. Spencer struck again just 3 minutes after the restart to make it 2-2 before Jose Sacia scored what appeared to be the winning goal in the 50th minute. And it was at this time that there was disturbances in the crowd. They started throwing objects, and the referee was hit by an object. He was bloodied. Just inferring from the news articles, he probably suffered a concussion as well. And the match was suspended for an hour. When the match resumed, Santos eventually scored in the 66th minute on a goal that they thought would give them the title because the match ended in a draw. And all Santos needed at that time was a draw. But what was unknown to Santos players and officials was that the Chilean referee concluded that the match as a contest was concluded. And this was as a result of the referee being hit. But the rest of the match was continued as a friendly in order to prevent further rioting. This is all well and good. The problem was that the Chilean referee only chose to inform the Peñarol team and the officials of that decision. The officials from the Sao Paulo Federation, including the manager of Santos and the president of Santos, leaned hard on the Chilean referee to continue the match and to give Santos the final 3-3 result. The Sao Paulo Federation official was quoted as calling the referee a coward for not continuing the match. And the Santos directors inferred indirectly or really directly that they couldn't guarantee the referee's safety if he left the stadium. Nevertheless, the referee stood firm, and the third match of the final was played at Estadio Monumental in Buenos Aires, home of River Plate. Both teams insisted on having a neutral referee. So the referee was a gentleman from the Netherlands. Santos would end up winning the third match 3-0. And this featured a dominant attacking display by their forward quintet. The first goal for Santos was actually an own goal by Peñarol's Omar Caetano as he attempted to deflect the cross from Coutinho. But the star of the match was Pelé, scoring a brace in the second half. The first involved a combination with Pepe and Dorval, which uh, which Pelé finished strongly outside the penalty area. And the second goal was one in which Coutinho made a jinky run, advanced to the end line before coming back to Pelé. So at long last, Santos were champions of America. Coutinho would be the top scorer of the Libertadores competition in 1962, scoring 6 goals. Pelé would contribute with 4 goals. Now, as a result of winning the Copa Libertadores, Santos FC would advance to the Intercontinental Cup. And in this cup, they would play Portugal's Benfica, who defeated Real Madrid in the European Cup final. This was billed as an encounter between two black pearls, Pelé and Eusebio. Benfica were also unbeatable at home over the last 2 seasons in domestic and continental competition. So there was a lot of expectation for the match, but there was also belief that Benfica would run out as the winners because of their home advantage in the return leg. In the first leg, Santos left victorious 3-2 at the Maracanã before 85,000. Pelé would score 2 goals, and Coutinho would score the other. Santana for Benfica scored both of the Eagles' goals. The second leg was simply sensational, and it represented perhaps the greatest achievement in the history of the Intercontinental Cup. In Lisbon, at the Estadio da Luz, before 73,000, Santos ran out 5-2 winners. Pelé got off to a blistering start, scoring 2 goals in the opening half hour. The first, a sliding effort to meet a lightning bolt cross from Pepe, and the second, in which he slalomed around 3 players and fired a left-footed shot past the keeper. Coutinho made it 3-0 before halftime, and that was all due to the work of Pelé. He danced past 4 defenders to the byline and then cut back to Coutinho for a simple tap-in. Pelé would go on to complete his hat trick in the most audacious manner possible, in one of the most audacious manners possible. He nutmegged Eusebio. He eluded 3 defenders, and he fired a hard shot toward the goalkeeper. He wasn't able to collect it, and Pelé raced in to grab the rebound and tapped in the net to complete his third goal. Pepe rounded off Santos' scoring before Eusebio and Santana gave Benfica a scant consolation. So with that win, Santos completed a historic quadruple, winning the state competition, the national competition, continental, and world championships. So this performance was summed up by the words of Benfica's keeper, Costa Pereira. He said, quote, "I arrived hoping to stop a great man, but I went away convinced that I had been undone by someone who was not born on the same planet as the rest of us." You know, Benfica's achievement in 1962 was a hard thing to top in 1963, but they came close. Um, they fell short in the Paulista tournament, but they won the Taça Brazil once again, and they entered the Copa Libertadores in 1963 as champions. So they entered in the semifinal phase. In the semifinal, they played Botafogo, drawing 1-1 in Sao Paulo. Um, Pelé scored an equalizer in the 90th minute before winning the second leg 4-0 in Rio de Janeiro. Pelé scoring a hat trick, a quite brilliant hat trick in 22 minutes in the 11th, 15th, and 33 minutes. And then Lima scored a late goal. In the final, Santos would play Argentina's Boca Juniors. In the first leg, Santos would win 3-2 in Rio before 100,000 at the Maracanã. It was a match in which the home side led 3-0 within the first 30 minutes. Coutinho made a brace, and Lima contributed with a third goal. In the second leg, Santos defeated Boca 3-2 at the Bombonera. After José Sanfilippo, the legendary Boca striker, scored an opener just before halftime, Coutinho equalized three minutes later. Pelé scored the title decider 8 minutes from time. So Santos repeated the feat of Peñarol, who won 2 consecutive Copa Libertadores titles in 1960 and 1961. Pelé's 5 goals, remember, in only 4 matches, were second only to Sanfilippo's 8 in the tournament. Coutinho contributed with 3 goals. Santos would go on to participate in the Intercontinental Cup, this time against AC Milan. So in the first leg, Milan won 4-2 at the San Siro. It was a match in which Pelé scored twice. So the resulting match, or the follow-on match in the second leg at the Maracanã, played before 130,000 people. Santos won 4-2. Milan took a 2-0 lead in the first 20 minutes, and it looked like Milan were going to run out winners. Santos changed their playing style from one that was, joga bonito, beautiful game, to one that was much more aggressive and borderline violent. I think Milan supporters would say that it was violent. And Santos also benefited from a lenient referee. They would go on to score 4 goals, 3 of them by free kicks. I believe 2 of them by Pepe with his thunderbolt of a foot. And the series went on to a tie-breaking third match. And in the third match, which is also played at the Maracanã, Santos would win 1-0. This was also a match that was characterized by aggressive play by the home side. Dalmo converted the penalty after Dorval was reported to dive in the box. This was an allegation that was raised by Italian spectators and journalists, and I think it was ultimately one that was confessed by the Santos players themselves. So Santos were world champions once again, but it was not an exhibition of the beautiful game. Now, those 2 years were the peak of Santos in world football, but they were still playing at a high level in later years. In 1964, they would win the Paulista title. They would also win another Taça Brazil. But in the Copa Libertadores, they would exit at the semifinal stage. In this year of the competition, Pelé was injured, so he didn't play. Dorval, Mengalvio, and Coutinho didn't play, And only Pepe from this devastating quintet featured for Peixe. And the semifinal, they lost both legs against Independiente. It was left to Tonino Guerrero to score in both legs for Santos. Pepe scoring the first leg, but wasn't enough, and they exited the competition in the group stage. In 1965, Santos won yet another Paulista title, and they won another Brazilian title. In fact, it was five Brazilian titles in a row for Santos, a mark that hasn't been replicated since. In the Libertadores in 1965, Santos swept the group stage. They were drawing against Universidad de Chile and Peru's Universitario, scoring 10 goals while allowing just three. In the semifinal, they would face old rival Peñarol in really what amounts to a continental derby, a continental classico. In the first leg, they defeated Mania 5-4 at home. Sensationally, they led 3-0 within the first 10 minutes of the game through graces by Pelé, and Dorval. The second leg saw them lose 3-2 in Montevideo. Pepe and Coutinho turned around the match after falling behind before a late comeback from Peñarol in the last 15 minutes gave Mania the victory. In the tie-breaking third match, Santos lost 2-1 in Buenos Aires after extra time. Juan Hoja put Peñarol in the lead before Pelé equalized, and Jose Cecilia scored the winner for Peñarol 6 minutes into extra time. Pelé would finish the tournament as the leading goal scorer in the competition with 8 goals. Pepe would score 4 goals. Now, in 1966, Santos would win the Rio Sao Paulo title once again, but they didn't compete in Copa Libertadores because Brazilian clubs boycotted the competition. And this was for multiple reasons, because of protests over the format, protests over rough treatment of Brazilian clubs. They did contribute 6 players to the Brazilian World Cup squad: Gilmar, Orlando, Pelé, Lima, Zito, and Edo. This was also a season in which Santos fell short in the other 2 principal competitions in Brazil. They fell short in the Paulista Championship, and they also fell short in the Taça Brasil. And it was at this time that Lula chose to leave the club. So wrapping up just a legendary 10-year stretch in charge of the team, a stretch that has not been replicated since in Brazilian football. Lula was replaced by Antoninho, who was an assistant under Lula. Under his tenure between 1966 and 1971, Santos would win 3 Paulista titles in a row in 1967, 68, and 69. And they would win their last Brazilian title during the Fantásticos era in 1968 through the contributions of Pelé, Clodoaldo, Edu, Adel, and Tonino. Santos would contribute 5 players to that legendary 1970 Brazil World Cup squad. Edu, João Camargo, Clodoaldo, Carlos Alberto, who was the captain, and of course, Pelé. Now, by the late 1960s, Santos would embark on more tours. They had a reputation of being a globe-trotting side, really since the late 1950s. But in 1969, they would tour even more exotic places. In 1969, they embarked on a tour of Africa, playing matches in Congo, Nigeria, and Benin, among other countries. And it was at this time that they developed a reputation as, quote, the team that stopped the war, end quote. And this was a result of warring factions in Congo and in Nigeria during the Civil War, um, imposing the ceasefire in order to allow Santos to play their match. Santos were given, parade. Santos players, well, principally Pele, were given parades through the principal cities of these African countries. They were this exotic team, this exotic world-leading team that was touring the world, and they received adulation and attention that very few clubs have received before or since. They also participated in tours as part of the politicking for João Havelange's campaign, his ultimately successful campaign for the FIFA presidency. And they embarked on tours of Africa and parts of the Middle East, principally the Arabian region. By the early 1970s, the Santasticos era was at its end. Former player Mauro Ramos took over a 2-year period between 1971 and 1972, but without much success. Pepe took over from him after a brief interim period of another foreign player who wasn't successful between 1972 and 1974, and Santos would win a Paulista title in 1973. This is a title that was actually shared with Portuguesa after what could only be called a symbolic penalty shootout. The referee called off the shootout when there were 2 penalty kicks to be made with Santos in the lead. Really wasn't clear why it was done, and the federation stepped in and gave both teams a shared title. In 1974, only 2 Santos players were on Brazil's World Cup squad. And this is the last time that we would see a Santos player on the squad for over 35 years. In fact, the next player who was on the books of Santos, who would be on the World Cup team, would be in 2010 with Robinho. So that closed the book on the Santasticos era. It was an era that saw Santos FC win 26 titles between 1955 and 1974. 12 state championships, 4 Rio Sao Paulo championships, 6 Brazilian titles, 2 Copa Libertadores, and 2 intercontinental titles. Now, the team has really had a hard time playing within that shadow of the great Santasticos era. They did win a title. They did win a state title in 1978 and in 1974, but it would be another 22 years before Santos would win another state title. The 2000s era saw a resurgence of Santos FC. They did win 2 Brazilian titles in 2002 and 2004 after a gap of 34 years. And they won it with players such as Canato in the back and Robinho, a new young phenomenon. They were runners-up in the Brazilian tournament in 2003 and 2007. And this is a time when the Brazilian Championship adopted that double round-robin format that persists today. And they went on to win 2 additional state titles in 2006 and 2007. In 2011, Santos will return to the top of South American football, winning Copa Libertadores for a 3rd time. And this was with talent such as Alexandro, Danilo, and more famously, Neymar. They would go on to win 4 state titles during the 2010s in 2011, 2012, 2015, and 2016. But by the end of the decade, Santos were finding it difficult to win national titles, and they were even finding it difficult to win state titles. Um, I think it and during that era, it became more difficult for them to compete economically with the giants from Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and even from Porto Alegre. So the decline started to set in. They floored with relegation over a couple of seasons, and finally in 2023, the club were relegated for the first time in their history. And like the Titanic, they sank below the waters. But unlike the Titanic, they're seeking to reconstruct their identity and reconstruct their place in the top flight of Brazilian football. They're currently in Serie B. They're a giant among regional powers, but they're turning to their youth and they're seeking to rise again and live up to the greatness of the Santasticos era. So that concludes this history vignette of Santos FC and Os Santasticos, the first South American super team in the Copa Libertadores era. Now, if you want to follow me and send a comment or question, my handle on X is @Soccermetrics. You can also send questions or comments to @SoccerDownHere or to Jason Longshore at Longshoe. We will answer your questions about the tournament in a future episode. And as always, we appreciate your comments on the show. The group stage of the Copa Libertadores concludes next week, so I'll be back next Monday to preview the final match day. This has been the Soccermetrics Copa Libertadores show, a production of Soccermetrics and Soccer Down Here. See you later. Hasta luego e até mais.